wanted to talk about first today is large and complex adaptations. So this is an area I talked about at the roadshows. So if you're at the roadshows recently, and please put your thoughts in the chat, because you'll have heard this already. But the issues that we know from the DFG Facebook group is that there's not that many of them, but they are high cost, high complexity, and always difficulties around designing a suitable scheme, understanding what's eligible for DFG, deciding what is a want and what is a need, identifying the funding, finding good contractors, dealing with unforeseen works, and this phrase, raising expectations, which I will come back to shortly. So in terms of the process that I think the majority of local authorities use, and home improvement agencies use to go through the DFG process for these large and complex adaptations, is that there's an OT assessment that happens at the start of the process. Quite often there's a feasibility joint visit with a surveyor at that point. And the idea is to develop a necessary appropriate scheme. That's then discussed at supervision with the manager or senior OT, principal OT, and taken to a DFG panel to consider whether that's the right thing to do. Then the surveyor or technical officer designs a scheme to meet the needs. And quite often, if the family want to do something else, have a preferred scheme, then they're told that they need to go and arrange that themselves. Scheme designs approved, you go through planning and building regs, tenders are sought from suitable contractors, and then everyone tries to put a funding package together. So I think that's fairly typical for the vast majority of large and complex DFGs. And please put your comments in the chat as we go. I'll pick some of them up as we get towards the end of this section. So while that's, I think, the way that the majority of DFGs or complex DFGs are done at the moment, what I want to do is look at whether that is actually the best way of going about it and whether there's some changes and tweaks we could make before we kind of embark on these sort of cases. So I think kind of the first one is around putting the funding package together last. So it's shown in the text, they put this funding before it goes to planning. But many cases, budget isn't considered until the quotes come back. And then everyone's trying to work out how they can spend 50, 60, 70, 80,000 pounds to meet the costs that have gone through the process. But if you think about normal building projects, perhaps apart from HS2 or similar large schemes, budget is never the design constraint for a building project. I've seen on Grand Designs every week, Kevin always asks for the budget at the start, at the end. Nobody ever goes in with a blank check. And the other thing I think about leaving this issue of the funding till the end is that the whole design process up to that point is then based on DFG eligibility and criteria, where other funding sources may have different requirements and flexibilities. You may be able to do a different range of things with the funding that won't have been considered up to that point. And there's a really interesting case from the Ombudsman probably 3 or 4 months ago now, where they've been going through a process of kind of revising what was needed, redesigning the scheme to meet the assessments that had been made. And over a period of about 2 years, the costs had escalated to the point where the case was now going to cost over £200,000. And there was no clear plan on how those works were going to be funded. And the whole thing had just run into the ground when, if kind of the issues around the budget had been discussed much earlier, I think there could have been a much better outcome. So I'm going to propose that knowing how much funding is likely to be available should be one of the first steps of your process. And if you go all the way back to the guidance in 1996, then it said that housing and social care should work together to have a policy on how they deal with these sort of adaptations. But very few, even though it's, 25 years ago, very few have that policy in place. So if we go back to step number 3, I think the question I would pose is, do you see it as your job to help families adapt their home, or is it to manage a DFG budget? Because I don't think they're the same thing. And if you look at these large and complex cases, they're likely to be the ones that need the most help and support, because it's really quite difficult to arrange quite a complex building project when you're in the middle of supporting or kind of caring for one of your family members. And I suppose my question is, should families be left to go it alone if they want something more than is DFG eligible in their own home? Why shouldn't they want something that's a little bit more, a little bit extra, if they've got extra funds to put towards that? And sometimes kind of resources or staffing may be an issue, but if these are the most difficult and complex cases and the ones that are most likely to go wrong, should these be the cases that you prioritize for support? Because when it goes wrong, and quite often they do go wrong, it's going to take you a hell of a lot of time and effort to try and sort them out. And I think it'd be much easier just to support these people in the first place, help them through the process. And if kind of resources really are an issue, then maybe spend a bit less time on things that are really simple, like stair lifts. I think somebody could probably manage a stair lift installation by themselves, but these kind of really complex cases are really difficult in many cases. So DFG panels, I think they delay the process totally unnecessarily. Every local authority has a grants officer whose job it is to decide whether an application will be approved or not. And it should be, that is the decision-making route for a DFG. Necessary and appropriate, which is usually discussed by panel, is only part of the criteria. And you know, it's the grants officer's job to look at the application as a whole. So certainly have supervision, certainly have multidisciplinary meetings to discuss cases, agree actions, consider the range of funding options, but having a panel early in the process as a gateway is, in my opinion, totally unnecessary, takes lots of time and resources, and completely delays the whole process. So I would ban them. I would ban them. And then moving one step further back to the start of the process, how much choice and control does the family have in what's going to be their home for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years? Do they at the earliest stage have an understanding of how much DFG they're likely to get, what other funding is available, what that whole funding package would be, that they can contribute to it, that they could get, they could extend their mortgage, they could have support from friends and family to develop a scheme that works for them? And are they active participants in the design process, or are they presented with a plan that just meets the assessed needs and told, accept that, or go and sort it out yourself? And I think that kind of leads me on to the phrase, don't raise expectations, which I do hear quite a lot. And people say, well, you don't go raising people's expectations. And when I hear that, I always think, well, where should their expectations be? Should they have no expectations and be grateful for what they receive? Or should a family expect to get the information and advice needed to make an informed decision on how their home can be adapted and understand the limitations on the level of funding that may be available? Is that a better place to start from? And if there's an agency service, support to implement those adaptations rather than leaving them to sort it by themselves. So what I'm proposing is to have a slightly different approach to these types of cases, where you have an honest and open initial conversation with family about what can be achieved through DFG and other sources of funding, talk through what the family want to achieve, not just what is assessed as being a need, work through what funding is likely to be available, look at how much the family can contribute, look at whether moving would be a better option, and agree that indicative budget, looking at the full range very early on in that process. Work to a budget. There's a great bit of software called pricedoctor.co.uk, which there's a free version, and it doesn't cost that much for the paid version, actually, where if you're designing an extension, you can very quickly get a really fairly accurate estimate of how much that's going to cost. And working alongside that, what I always found really useful was to sketch out scheme proposals print them out on big sheets of paper, so kind of at least A2 size, and sit around the table, technical officer, OT, and the family, scribbling all over them with Sharpies, and just kind of working out, is that wall better there? Is this wall better here? Can the toilet go there? Is there a good turning circle here? And just working through the considerations to get to the best scheme that's going to work for them. Work through those kind of issues and costs, think about the contingencies, the risks, ground conditions, drains, and reach an agreement on all this before working drawings, planning, quotes, etc. are agreed, so that you're working collaboratively with the family rather than kind of butting heads around what is kind of DFG eligible or not. And I think that is kind of a really positive way to work with people. And certainly towards the end of when I was doing this in practice, I found that a much more positive experience to go through. So let's have a quick look at some of the comments on the chat. So Chris from Lancaster said they've been doing that on CAD for a while. I think I'm printing on O2, printing on A2, John. I think that's for the local authority to print on A2 and take them out rather than the families. No panels in West Sussex feel like barriers. I think they do. So I think when I did this at the roadshows, there were some people that were kind of nodding and agreeing with me, and then others felt a little bit passionate about the kind of way they do things at the moment. So I think it's a topic that we're going to be continuing with for a while, because if you look at local government ombudsman cases, these are so problematic so often. And if you look at the data from around the country in terms of the Delta returns, there are many local authorities that seem to steer clear of extensions and large adaptations entirely, when I suppose I struggle to believe that there's not people in those areas that would benefit from these sort of works. So it's a topic we'll be continuing with over the next 6 or 12 months. And if you're interested to join the conversation, then please keep typing away in the chat, and be good to get your kind of thoughts on how we can do this better going forwards.